Studio is a great LEGO digital design program, allowing for the construction of some incredible builds, but a lot of its features are unexplained and there aren't that many guides available for how to use all of these features. One incredible tool of Studio is the Instruction Maker. While other programs such as the LEGO Digital Designer can auto-generate instructions for you, these can sometimes be flawed with parts clipping through each other and the steps being in the wrong order. Studio allows builders to design every aspect and every step of their instructions, and I'm going to show you how it works, and I'm also going to go through my process of making instructions, as well as some tips on making your instructions look good. The two models we'll be looking at today when designing instructions are my Uplink mech model and my LEGO Trebuchet model. Now, a good tool we should first get used to before we get into any instruction making is the Submodel tool. Submodel tool allows us to take large groups of parts as a group, and we can manipulate them as a group. This can help in posing, but also help in designing instructions. To create a submodel, all you need to do is select a large group of parts, click the Create into Submodel button at the bottom right, or just right-click and go to the Submodel tool and create. Now I've created a duplicate of the trebuchet here that we can first look at to design our instructions. Now, a lot of people who use Studio don't know what this right step list window is for. This is essentially the basic view of your instructions. In more complex models, you'll see a few more steps. If you want to start your instructions, I recommend simply deleting all your steps so you only have one left. You will only ever have one, and if you try and click delete, nothing will happen. From here, we can go into our instruction view. Make sure you've saved every other model before you go into the instruction view, as you cannot enter instruction view with unsaved models. And this is what the instruction maker looks like. We have two segments, the step editor and the page designer. The step editor is how we order the steps that we want this model to be built in. The page designer is how we make those steps look really pretty. Now, because I've submodeled it, we have two major components of this, the base and the arm, and we can then edit the steps that these submodels are then performed in. Now this is what the step editor for the arm segment copy looks like. The reason we use submodels is sort of similar to what LEGO does. They have their instructions built in sections, and we also want our models to have their instructions built in sections. This makes them easier to build, and we can focus on getting large chunks done rather than having to search through everything. Whether it's a submodel or all one build, everything has the same general appearance. All of your parts will appear here. This doesn't seem like much, but if you have a 2,000 plus brick model and no submodels, this is going to get very cluttered very quickly. So this is where submodels really help in the instructions. We can simplify what we're focusing on. We can work out where all the parts are, and it makes this easier and faster for us to build instructions. Now, when we first want to start, we need to think, where's the builder going to start? What's the easiest point? Now, when I did this instruction set, I chose this main Technic beam. When we select a part, we have two options, to put it in the step before or put it in the step after. I always recommend the step before, as this way we can see the logical progression of the start to the end point, and we can see how the builder would assemble it. Now, while you can do step after, and you can do things in reverse, you won't see it from the perspective of the builder who has to build it step by step. You can click on parts to select them, or you can click them down here. By control clicking, you can select multiple parts, and rather than clicking step before or step after, you can simply drag them to the relevant step. Now let's say you had parts in an incorrect step and you wanted them to be somewhere before or after. You could just select them and drag them to where you want them to be. Now here I have a submodel within a submodel. Again, designing submodel instructions are as simple as selecting it, clicking View Steps. Here I've already done the steps, and you can see it's a logical progression to the build. Simply build this section, attach these two beams on the axles, and clip it all together. Here this bar has been threaded through these two chains. We can select them all into one step, as eventually we can set it up in the page design to make it clear that this bar has to be threaded through. You can also click and drag to select multiple components. This can be quite easier than just selecting the bits and pieces or control clicking everything. Whenever faced with something like this, an axle or something else with two components either side of it, I often recommend building one full side including the axle first, and then doing the other side. This way, the reader knows, okay, I'm going to do this section, attach the main bit I've already built, and then this remaining section. Now let's focus on some of the similar submodels we saw earlier. In this build, I have 4 submodels that are similar. I have these bracing components, which you can also see here. I have these wooden beam components, which are used all around. I have these strut components, which are seen all around. And I have these 2 flames, which are actually submodels of each other. Now, a key component of these submodels is that they are linked. They are essentially all identical, and if you change one, you change the other. You can undo this by selecting Unlink from Submodel. However, this is very beneficial to us when making instructions. Rather than tell you to build this strut, and then build this strut, and then build this strut, I can tell you, build this strut, and then do it 4 times. That way, we can simplify things, make it a bit easier. Now, I've already done the instructions for the base frame copy, and this is where the instructions for submodels come into play. All of these wooden beam submodels have the exact same step. So if I click into this one, you can see it's 1 stud, 2 stud, flat stud. If I click into any of the other ones, they are identical. That's because if I affect one, I affect the rest. If I were to delete this step, so we go from 2 studs to 3 studs, and select another one, they all have the exact same instruction set. When it comes to the page design step, we can simplify this really quickly. And as you can see, I've also done this with the flame submodels, the bracing submodels, and the strut submodels. And here we have the model with all the instructions for every part and every submodel completed. Now we can move on to the page design, and this is where the fun really begins. First of all, let's look at elements of the UI. Lock page will lock a page, and effectively, you can't edit it. It will stay as it is. Change layout will change the layout of the instructions. Maybe you want to have 2 steps or 3 steps or even 6 steps on the same page. Clicking apply to followings will make it apply to everything after that step. Insert will allow you to insert images, texts, arrow, flip, size guides, color guides, and bill of materials. Flip refers to this icon and is used by LEGO when the model has to be rotated to insert certain components. When you have a Technic component, you can insert a size guide and then select the relevant Technic component. For example, here we have an axle, and this will give you an axle size. This is 1-to-1 scale with the size of your page, so whilst it doesn't appear 1-to-1 on my screen, it is 1-to-1 in reality. If I were to print this, I would have this at the correct size. Color guide will give you a list of components of which you can select, and then will give you another small view of that component and the color it appears in. As this is done in brown, it will come in brown. Selecting another component, like what I've used in the flame, this is officially trans light orange. So if we select it, we'll get a flame in trans light orange. And finally, we have the option of inserting a bill of materials. If you insert this, you will be greeted with this absolute mess. As a result, I encourage you to only use this at the end of a model's instruction set. In the top right corner, we have the page setup option, which will give you the setup for your page. Here I'm using an A4 landscape page with margins and RGB settings. I pretty much recommend you stick with this, as unless you want to do your instructions in A4 portrait or some other shape such as A3 or in custom, you really don't need to mess with these settings. Next, we have the export tool. This is what you use when you've completed your instructions, and we can export our pages as all our pages or just selections of our pages. We have the option of PDF or PNG. PNG also allows you to do transparent backgrounds. However, I don't think you should do this, as custom backgrounds are a lot more entertaining and more enjoyable. The size options are in 1x quality, 2x quality, or 4x. However, be warned that the more you do, the longer it'll take to render these. Next, we have our formatting options. Here we have the options on this page, and we have the ability to revert, which will set them to default, or we can update our global. This is the global style of all our pages. So our first option is the background, which is currently set to be filled as white. We can also add a border to our background, which would be 8 pixels of black. We can also select this based on RGB or CMYK color options. We can also give a radius to ours, which will result in there being curves to the border color. Next is the line separator option. Now for this, you need to show, this can only really be shown when you have multiple steps on one page. The line separator can give you lines between your columns and your rows, like so. The rows will always have a split in them, however, and you can't reverse this to do it otherwise. You can change the thickness of the lines and the color. The slot spacing tool will change how far apart your steps are. So for example, if I were to change this to 5, you can see what kind of change it does. These are now separated by 5 inches. You can make this millimeters or pixels if you so choose. If we've modified a page, we can click revert, and this will restore our default options from our global. We can also update our global to change what the master page will essentially look like. Now here we have the global style editor. Here is the default style, and you can save multiple styles by clicking save as. We have the fill option, the border option, the radius option, the line separator options, and the slot spacings from before. Then we also have some more new features, like step number. Turning it on and off will simply turn the step on and off. Here we have the typeface, the weighting, which you can switch from bold to normal to italic to bold and italic, which doesn't have spaces. You can change the size and the color of your steps, as well as the padding. This is the distance from the corners and the other components that it has. So for example, if I make this 5, this now has a box width of 5, and this parts list box is now 5 inches away from the step. This is again something I wouldn't really fiddle with, as step number, it's pretty much fine. I don't see a reason to modify this. Parts list will pertain to the parts list. You can turn that on and off. You have a fill option, which is default Lego light blue. You can change the border, the radius, the scaling, which is quite useful if you have quite cluttered pages. Note that this will affect every other step in your instruction booklet, however. You are also given it typeface options, weighting, size and color, and indentation, top and padding. There's also padding for this as well. Again, this is not stuff I would mess with. New part highlight is something, however, I do recommend you change, as you can see this in some of the steps we've already looked over. New parts will be highlighted whenever they are placed down, which is why I often deselect this option, as it's quite glaring, and most of the time you can see where the new part is. Here is the step before. There are no 1x1 bricks on the sides, and now there are. There are other options, however, if you would like to make new parts more obvious as a result of them being obscured, like this one in the back. Submodel preview. This pertains to this section. I can disable it or enable it. It has a fill, which is the standard Lego tannish color. It has the border, radius, typeface, and padding options as before. Now, callouts are something that are not by default included in instructions. They have a standard Lego color, border, line separator, and step number as usual, but then they have these arrow options. Now, you may wish to mess with these arrow options later, but first we'll look into what a callout is. Next is a size guide, which has all the defaults that we usually see. This would pertain to this little box here. We change the padding, the weight, the typeface. Again, don't recommend you do it, but you could. The colors guide effectively functions as the same thing. But that's only scratching the surface of what Studio's Instruction Designer can do. If we select a component, the format system changes. We are now greeted to step components, parts list, and submodel preview options, which we can enable and disable per instruction set. We also have change to step view, which if you click this option, you can rotate your model. You can flip your model. And you can change the scale of your model, as well as the setup of the camera. You can input custom degrees to give your model a custom look. You can change the scale based on your page. Maybe you want to fit the 6 steps in one page, and so you need to make it smaller. And you can change how it looks so you can see where to put all your pieces. Do be warned, if you change the scale, this will affect the scale of every step afterwards. For example, if I were to change the step view on this one and increase the scale, it has affected every model, and you can see it's also affected every model here in the page viewer after it. It won't affect models before it, however. Now to explain why submodels are just fantastic in Studio, select the first step of any submodel build and click Convert to Callout. Give it a little bit of time, and it will generate a small set of instructions on how to build the callout in that step. So now we have to build 4 of these struts, no problem, 1 step. This is where you can really do some cool things, and you can get arrows at the bottom that you can then drag to your components if these want to let me do it. Be warned that they stack on top of each other, and you can't really select. You can only really select the top arrow, provided there isn't an arrow already in the way. And this is where the options come into play. You can affect the size of the arrows, you can make them straight lines, you can affect the number, which I find quite useful. Maybe you only want only one to draw attention to it, like this is where this piece is, I'm drawing attention to it. You can change the color, which is also very useful if you have certain backgrounds. For example, if we made this pure white, we would only see this section. If we made it black, it might interfere with the black of these pieces. Now we can make it look like so. You can also change the thickness of an arrow, which makes it easier to see. Now that we've looked at all the features that you can do in Studio's Instruction Maker, I'm going to walk through my process of making instructions in the Page Designer. Because in the step editor, I already sort of explained that. I like to do my steps in a way that the builder can easily read them and they make sense. Putting no more than maybe 3 to 6 parts in one step and no more than 3 to 4 different kinds of parts in one step. Also, I submodel a lot, but that's just good practice. So what I like to do is I like to design custom instruction covers. This is just an image, which you can do by creating a new page in front of your instructions, clicking Insert, and then clicking an image. The sizing of the images is 850 to 600, which is based on the page setup of 842 and 595. Whilst this does result in some cropping, it does ensure that none of the white from the background is shown. Alternatively, you could just turn the background to black and then it would just look like a little bit of a border. This was done in Photoshop, and you can basically achieve the same with any other photo editing software. This is a render, the background is from a LEGO Exoforce image, as is the logo, as is Rio over here, and all of this is just boxes, polygons, and angles. Now, another thing you can do with your instructions is add backgrounds. I know LEGO Bionicle did this, I'm pretty sure LEGO Exoforce did this, I'm not entirely sure about others, but doing so makes it look a lot more professional and adds a lot more character to your instructions. This isn't a plain white background, this shows you, ooh, there's something to see here, and it makes looking at the pages a little bit more interesting than a plain white background. Again, this is just a simple image, and it is size 842 and 594, which is roughly the same size as the page. What you do with this is you insert an image, click Insert Image, and then you send to back. This means it is now at the back of your page, as everything on a page is essentially on a layer. If I bring to front, it is now on the front of the page. If I send backward, 3 is the highest thing on this page aside from now the image. If I send backward, now 1's there, and now it's probably going to be 2. Okay, so image, send to back. So here's an example of how you implement the easy to see features. So in this step, we've added 2 of these gray pieces and 4 of these light gray half Technic pins. Now, an option I didn't say earlier is in this step, you can select one of the pieces you've added and click Activate Buffer Exchange. I consider this to be a bit more of an advanced feature, however, and that's why I didn't include it earlier. Now, this gives us the offset option, an arrow option, and arrow styling options. Clicking on any one of these tools will shift the part in the build menu. You can also manually enter them. So here I'm going to click 60, which is fairly good. Now this would generate an arrow, but it's probably hidden behind the image, so if I center back, boom, there is the arrow. I'll just bring the arrow to the front. So bring to front, and then I can just have that. And now you can see this pin needs to go to this arrow. However, you can also reshape this arrow and make it a little bit easier. Here I've had to rotate the part, so I've included a rotation flip image, which helps with that, and I've also included another arrow. You can also move the actual model in the step. Here I've had it centered, and it will auto-guide you to the center if you wish. Here I've moved the submodel image to the side where it interacts nicely with the parts list. Here you can see I've implemented a callout. Other options you have when doing a callout is you can change it from rows to columns. However, this is more up to your personal taste and how the instructions are done. You also have the option to convert it back to a step view. Utilizing the buffer exchange and arrows is quite useful when you're threading Technic axles through multiple objects. Here I'm threading it through a ball joint, a gear, and a couple of Technic beams. Sometimes you will have floating bricks that won't do anything until the next step. Here I've included some text to point that out. Once you get the hang of the buffer tool, you can really use it to your heart's content. Here I've got 3 pieces, each one buffered, and a series of arrows telling them where to be placed. And that was my tutorial on how to make instructions using Studio's instruction making tools. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I will include instructions to the builds you have seen in this video in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.
Let's break it.